To speak in support of what we've been doing on the Senate floor all past 2 weeks. Moving forward on the National Defense Authorization Act, I would like to pay a compliment, my deepest respect, to the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, to the ranking member, to all the members of the Armed Services Committee who have been focused on this bill that we've been putting forward in this Congress, in every Congress for the last half century. Mr. President, our forces are under strain at a time when Henry Kissinger quoted before the Armed Services Committee, quote, that the United States has not faced a more diverse and complex array of crises since the end of the Second World War. And here are what some of our top military officials have told our committee. Told our committee about the threats that are rising globally and the dramatic reduction in our military forces. The Chief of Staff of the Army, General Mark Milley, recently stated that due to cuts and threats that the Army is, quote, at a state of high military risk when it comes to defend our interests. Mr. President, that's a very, very serious statement by the Chief of Staff of the Army. High military risk for our military and the ability for the U.S. Army to do its mission. He also said that when it came to Russia and its new aggressiveness, we were, quote, outranged and outgunned. Let me spend a little bit of time on the new challenge from Russia. There are provisions, many in this bill, which is why it's so important, that will strengthen our military threat with regard to Russia. Something that, as the senator from Alaska, I am very concerned about. Mr. President, nobody spoke more eloquently and compellingly about our country's credibility than President Reagan when he stated his philosophy with dealing with our potential adversaries was, quote, we maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. And he matched his rhetoric with credible action. And that's what we need to do with regard to the NDAA, and that's why it's so important that we move forward and pass this bill. But it's the Russian threat that's not just in Europe, but it's also in the Arctic. And those threats, we are seeing more and more in committee testimony on what the Russians are doing. Just take, for example, 4 new Arctic brigades, a new Arctic command, 14 operational airfields in the Russian Arctic by the end of this year, up to 50 airfields by 2020, a 30% increase in Russian special forces in the Arctic, 40 Russian-owned, government-owned icebreakers with 11 additional icebreakers in development right now, including nuclear icebreakers. Huge land claims in the Arctic. Increased long-range air patrols with Bear bombers, the most since the Cold War, which pilots in Alaska are intercepting these Russian bombers on a weekly basis. And a redeployment of 2 sophisticated S-400 air defense systems, again in the Arctic. Why are they doing this? Because it's a strategic place, new transportation routes, enormous resources, and the Secretary of Defense, our own Secretary of Defense, stated in testimony that he realized we were late to the Arctic, given how strategic and important it is. Right now we have no Arctic port infrastructure, 2 icebreakers, that's it. No plans to increase Arctic-capable special forces, and a lack of surveillance capabilities in this strategic region of the world. Why do I mention this, Mr. President? Because in this NDAA, we start to address the problem. Just like we did in last year's NDAA, we start to lay the foundation of having a strategic vision of what's going on in the Arctic, the way the Russians are, and we're being prepared in an area of the world that is absolutely critical to the United States' security. So provisions include the first steps to build up an appropriate strategic Arctic port, We will also build up our Arctic domain awareness, and we will have a much better sense of what is going on in this region, not only with regard to the Russians, but the Chinese are doing in this critical area of the world. Mr. President, make no mistake, America is an Arctic nation. We're an Arctic nation because of my state, the state of Alaska. This NDAA begins the important process to start addressing the strategic concerns we're seeing in the Arctic and securing our nation in a way that's important for all of us. I yield the floor.